Today when you think of computers, you think of small, everyday objects used by billions of people around the world. This was not always the case. The first computers were made in the 1950s and were nothing like what we have today. They were giant, room-sized machines that were made for calculating numbers, hence the name computer. Compute meaning calculate. They were also extremely expensive. This all changed in 1964 when Pierre Perotto created the Programma 101, the first desktop computer ever made. Even though there was desktop computers available, they didn't really get popular until about the 1980s, when more companies such as Microsoft and IBM expanded on the concept of a desktop computer. Desktop computers were a lot smaller and cheaper than the giant ones, which made them very popular. These computers were definitely a step up from the room-sized computers, but they were still very different from the ones we know today. Instead of being able to click icons on a home screen to open them, you had to physically put the application into the computer and then type a list of commands to run the application. There was also no mouse. This was mostly because you didn't need one because there wasn't a user interface, but it still just shows how far computers have gone. These computers were called IBM-compatible computers because they ran MS-DOS, an operating system made by IBM working with another company called Microsoft. IBM-compatible computers could be made by any computer company, but as long as they ran DOS, they were considered IBM-compatible. This made it easier for computing companies because instead of having to write their own operating system, they only had to make the physical parts of the computer, and they could just run DOS on it. With this in mind, a young company called Apple Computers created the Macintosh, a computer that, instead of typing commands to run certain things, made it so that all you had to do was find the application icon, double-click it, and you were done. The whole computer was designed to be extremely user-friendly and easy to use, meaning the average person could master the Macintosh in mere hours. It was revolutionary. And this is the story of that company, of its beginnings to the creation of the Mac, to it almost going out of business, and much more. This is the unlikely success of Apple. From the very start, Apple wasn't likely to succeed. It was started by two college dropouts, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Later that year, they made the Blue Box, which was a machine that let you make long-distance calls for free. With the profits from the Blue Boxes, Steve Wozniak was able to build his own computer. Him and Jobs decided to sell it and called it the Apple I. It sold pretty well, but not as well as they hoped. After that, they came out with the Apple II, which was a huge success, and the Apple III, which was a disaster because of a design flaw that Jobs insisted would work. This was the first instance of many where Jobs was extremely stubborn. This would eventually lead to the downfall of Apple, but more on that later. Apple had competition from other computer companies such as IBM and Microsoft. They were beating Apple in sales, and Jobs wasn't happy. So, against the wishes of the board members, in 1984, Apple released the Macintosh, the first computer with a working GUI, or graphic user interface. The GUI meant you could click applications with the mouse to open them instead of typing commands into the computer. Prior to the Macintosh release, Apple released the historic commercial in 1984, which was made to promote the Macintosh. The commercial depicted seemingly brain-dead people sitting in front of a large screen with a man on it. The man was talking about how everyone and everything is the same, and how nothing will ever change. Right after that, a woman runs into the room and throws a sledgehammer at the screen, smashing it. Then an announcer says, in 1984, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you will see why 1984 won't be like 1984. This is referring to a book called 1984 by George Orwell, where the future is ruled by a televised man called Big Brother, and where everyone is basically a brain-dead sheep. The commercial was saying that you were a sheep to IBM, Microsoft, and any other tech company, and that the Macintosh will save you. This was a very popular ad because it was very deep and thought out, especially for a computer ad. Despite this, the Macintosh still fell behind in sales, although Jobs promised it wouldn't. This was another example of Jobs being stubborn. Because of this, the board of directors fired Jobs. Prior to this, Wozniak also left the company because he was frustrated with Jobs. After a couple years without Jobs, Apple almost went bankrupt due to bad contracts they signed with other computer companies. To help save the company, the board grudgingly decided to rehire Jobs. He was quickly able to find a loophole and get them out of the contracts. Jobs had temporarily saved Apple, but they were still in debt and on the verge of bankruptcy. Seemingly out of nowhere, Apple's main rival, Microsoft, proposed a deal that gave Apple $150 million, saving the company. This is another example of how unlikely Apple's success was. Getting money from a rival company in order to stay in business? Not very likely. But that was nothing compared to what was coming next. Steve Jobs, despite being fired from his own company and having a rough history with computers, was a genius. After the Microsoft deal, Apple started rebuilding its brand. One way they did this was by introducing the iMac, a new and improved version of the Macintosh. This boosted Apple's sales to a height they hadn't seen in years. Jobs also introduced iTunes, a digital music store where users could buy songs over the internet instead of going to physical stores. He also released the iPod, a digital music player that could play the songs that you bought on iTunes anywhere you want. This was another example of how smart Jobs was. No one had thought of this concept before, and he made it work. The iPod quickly became a leader in the digital music industry. After these successes, the board of directors started trusting Jobs a little more after the Macintosh crisis. This all leads up to January 9th, 2007, when Apple held the keynote to introduce possibly the most revolutionary piece of technology in existence, the iPhone. It combined the iPod, the iMac, and the telephone all into one device. It also introduced touchscreen technology that let users touch with their finger instead of a stylus and could tell how many fingers were on the screen at one time. The iPhone was also much more powerful than any other cell phone that was on the market. It was basically a computer in your pocket. Users could call people on it.
Yes, I'd like to order 4,000 lattes to go, please. No, just kidding. Wrong number. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Browse the web.
We're showing you the whole New York Times website, and there it is. And guess what I can do? I can just put this into landscape mode, and there it is right there.
Buy and play music.
And if I want to pick somebody, let's say I want to pick the Beatles, I just tap them, and here's the Beatles songs with their albums right here. I want to play Sgt. Pepper's, I just hit Sgt. Pepper's right there, and a little help from my friends. Look at this gorgeous album artwork here. Of course, I got a volume control.
And more. The iPhone sold very well, unlike the Mac, which didn't sell as much. The iPhone boosted Apple's sales higher than ever and made Apple one of the biggest tech companies in the world. This is yet another reason why, even though he is very stubborn and hard to work with, Steve Jobs is a genius. No one would have expected a small company started by a couple of college dropouts in a garage to revolutionize the technology industry 3 times in its life. Once with the Macintosh for its GUI, once for iTunes, which changed the way people shop for music, and once with the iPhone. Especially considering just 10 years earlier that company fired its own CEO and was on the verge of bankruptcy. Apple wasn't likely to succeed, even from the beginning, but they beat the odds and came out on top. After the iPhone's release in 2007, Apple continued to make improvements as well as new versions almost every year. In 2010, they created a new market for tablet computers with the release of the iPad, which was a larger version of the iPhone that could make phone calls. The iPhone's popularity made more tech companies want to have their own smartphones, such as Samsung, who released their first smartphone in 2009. Despite this, the iPhone was always the most popular smartphone. It was superior in software, design, and overall user experience. Steve Jobs continued to run Apple as CEO until August of 2011, when he resigned due to health issues. He died in October of the same year due to pancreatic cancer at the age of 56. His successor was Tim Cook, who continues to run the company to this day. Today, Apple has grown to become one of the biggest technology companies in the world, with a net worth of over $2 trillion. Since 2011, they improved on many products like the iPhone, iPad, Mac, MacBook, and more. They also released new products such as the Apple Watch, AirPods, Apple TV, Apple HomePod, and more. Apple's had a rough journey, and to be honest, not many people thought it would succeed. Despite this, Steve Jobs was always convinced it would succeed, so he kept trying new things, even when they failed. Even when his own company fired him. Even when the company that fired him rehired him to save the company. Even when he had to convince the owner of a rival company to give them money. He stuck with his goal, and in the end, Apple succeeded.